Picture this: a political movement that started with a single slogan has transformed into what its supporters claim is a comprehensive blueprint for America's future. Whether you love it or hate it, the MAGA movement has undeniably reshaped American politics in ways that continue to reverberate through every corner of society. But what if I told you that behind all the rallies, the rhetoric and the heated debates, there's actually a detailed philosophical framework that goes far deeper than most people realise? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial yet influential political books of our time. Charlie Kirk's The MAGA Doctrine isn't just another campaign memoir or political rant. It's positioned as a systematic exploration of the ideas that Kirk believes will determine whether America thrives or fails in the coming decades. And here's what makes this particularly fascinating. Kirk isn't just some random political commentator. He's the founder of Turning Point USA, one of the largest conservative student organisations in America, and he's been at the epicenter of conservative youth activism for over a decade. This book has sparked fierce debates across political lines, with supporters calling it a masterful articulation of conservative principles and critics dismissing it as partisan propaganda. But regardless of where you stand politically, there's no denying that understanding these ideas is crucial for anyone trying to make sense of modern American politics. Kirk presents what he sees as the fundamental battle for America's soul, and his arguments have influenced millions of young conservatives across the country. So buckle up, because we're about to explore the ideas that have shaped one of the most significant political movements of our generation. Charlie Kirk's The MAGA Doctrine emerges from a unique perspective in American conservative politics. Kirk, who founded Turning Point USA at just 18 years old, has spent his entire adult life building one of the most influential conservative youth movements in modern American history. His organisation has reached millions of college students across thousands of campuses, making him a significant voice in shaping the political consciousness of an entire generation of young conservatives. Published in 2023, this book represents Kirk's attempt to systematise and articulate what he sees as the core principles underlying the Make America Great Again movement. Rather than focusing solely on electoral politics or personality-driven narratives, Kirk positions his work as a philosophical treatise on the fundamental ideas that will determine America's trajectory in the 21st century. The book's timing is significant, arriving at a moment when American political divisions have reached historically unprecedented levels. Kirk writes against the backdrop of what he characterises as an existential struggle between two competing visions of America's future. On one side, he argues, stands the MAGA Doctrine, with its emphasis on national sovereignty, economic nationalism and cultural traditionalism. On the other stands what he terms the globalist progressive agenda, which he claims threatens the very foundations of American identity and prosperity. Kirk's approach differs from many political books in its systematic nature. Rather than relying primarily on anecdotal evidence or emotional appeals, he attempts to construct a comprehensive ideological framework. He draws from historical examples, economic data, and philosophical arguments to support his positions. The book is structured as both a defense of MAGA principles and a roadmap for their implementation across various spheres of American life. What makes this work particularly noteworthy is Kirk's focus on the youth. Having spent years engaging with college students and young professionals, he brings a unique understanding of how these ideas resonate with younger generations who will ultimately determine America's political future. The MAGA Doctrine is fundamentally organised around what Kirk identifies as the core pillars of sustainable American greatness. The book argues that America stands at a critical crossroads, with the choices made in the coming years determining whether the nation will continue as a sovereign republic or transform into something entirely different. Kirk's central thesis revolves around the concept of America First as a governing philosophy rather than merely a campaign slogan. He contends that this principle should guide decision-making across all areas of policy, from international trade agreements to immigration policy to military interventions abroad. The book systematically examines how this principle applies to various challenges facing contemporary America. The work is heavily focused on what Kirk characterises as the failure of the American establishment, both Republican and Democrat, to serve the interests of ordinary Americans. He argues that decades of globalist policies have weakened American institutions, undermined economic opportunities for the middle class, and eroded the cultural foundations that made America exceptional. The MAGA Doctrine, in his view, represents a necessary correction to these destructive trends. Kirk dedicates substantial attention to economic policy, arguing that economic nationalism is essential for American prosperity. He critiques free trade orthodoxy and advocates for policies that prioritize American workers and manufacturers over global economic integration. This economic nationalism, he argues, is not protectionism for its own sake, but rather a recognition that nations must prioritize their own citizens' welfare. The book also addresses cultural and social issues, with Kirk arguing that America's strength has historically derived from shared values and common identity. He contends that multiculturalism and identity politics have fragmented American society and weakened the social cohesion necessary for democratic governance. The MAGA Doctrine, according to Kirk, offers a path toward restoring national unity based on shared American principles rather than ethnic or racial identities. Throughout the work, Kirk positions himself as speaking for a new generation of conservatives who reject both the failures of the Republican establishment and the radical agenda of the progressive left. The book's argumentation unfolds through several major thematic sections that build upon each other to create Kirk's comprehensive vision for American renewal. Kirk begins with what he calls the Great Awakening of American voters to the reality of establishment failure. He argues that the 2016 election represented a fundamental rejection of the bipartisan consensus that had governed America for decades. According to Kirk, both Republican and Democratic establishments had become captured by globalist interests that prioritized international integration over American sovereignty. The MAGA movement emerged as ordinary Americans recognized that their interests were being systematically ignored by political elites who were more concerned with maintaining their position within international institutions than serving their own constituents. The economic dimension of the MAGA Doctrine receives extensive treatment in Kirk's analysis. He argues that decades of free trade agreements, most notably NAFTA and China's entry into the World Trade Organization, fundamentally altered America's economic structure in ways that benefited global capital while devastating American manufacturing communities. Kirk contends that these policies were sold to the American people as inevitable consequences of globalization, when in reality they represented political choices that could have been made differently. The MAGA Doctrine's economic nationalism seeks to reverse these trends by prioritizing policies that strengthen American manufacturing, reduce dependence on foreign supply chains, and ensure that international economic relationships serve American interests. Kirk dedicates significant attention to what he characterizes as the immigration crisis and its relationship to American identity. He argues that mass immigration, particularly illegal immigration, has been used by political elites to suppress wages for American workers while transforming the cultural character of American communities. The MAGA Doctrine's approach to immigration, according to Kirk, begins with the recognition that nations have both the right and the obligation to control their borders and determine who becomes a citizen. He contends that immigration policy should serve American interests rather than global humanitarian concerns, and that successful immigration requires assimilation into American culture rather than the maintenance of separate ethnic enclaves. The book extensively examines what Kirk calls the deep state and its role in undermining democratic governance. He argues that unelected bureaucrats, intelligence agencies, and international organizations have accumulated power that rightfully belongs to elected officials and the American people they represent. Kirk contends that these institutions have become vehicles for advancing globalist agendas that conflict with the will of American voters. The MAGA Doctrine seeks to restore democratic accountability by reducing the power of unelected institutions and ensuring that American foreign and domestic policy reflects the preferences of American citizens rather than international elites. Kirk's analysis of American education reveals what he sees as systematic indoctrination of young Americans into anti-American ideologies. He argues that educational institutions from elementary schools through universities have been captured by progressive activists who teach students to hate their own country and reject the principles that made America great. The MAGA Doctrine's approach to education emphasizes restoring patriotic education that teaches students about America's achievements while acknowledging its flaws in proper historical context. The cultural dimension of Kirk's argument focuses on what he characterizes as the assault on traditional American values. He contends that progressive activists have systematically attacked the family, religious faith, and other institutions that historically provided the moral foundation for American democracy. Kirk argues that the MAGA Doctrine recognizes that political freedom ultimately depends on moral character, and that societies that abandon traditional values inevitably lose their capacity for self-governance. Kirk concludes this section with an analysis of America's role in the world under the MAGA Doctrine. He argues that America should remain engaged internationally, but from a position of strength that prioritises American interests. This means ending what he calls endless wars that drain American resources without serving clear national interests, while maintaining military superiority to deter potential adversaries. The MAGA Doctrine's foreign policy seeks to restore respect for American power while avoiding the imperial overstretch that has characterised recent decades. Understanding Kirk's key arguments provides insight into the intellectual framework that has influenced millions of American conservatives, particularly among younger demographics. The primacy of national sovereignty emerges as perhaps the most fundamental principle in Kirk's framework. He argues that nations must maintain control over their own affairs rather than subordinating their decision-making to international institutions or global consensus. This principle applies across multiple policy areas, from trade agreements that limit American economic flexibility to military alliances that constrain American strategic options. Kirk contends that sovereignty was not isolationism, but rather the foundation for effective international engagement from a position of strength. Economic nationalism represents another core takeaway from Kirk's analysis. He argues that America's economic policies should prioritise the welfare of American workers and communities over abstract economic theories about global efficiency. This means being willing to accept somewhat higher consumer prices if necessary to maintain domestic manufacturing capacity and good-paying American jobs. Kirk contends that the economic benefits of globalisation have been unevenly distributed, with elites capturing most gains while ordinary Americans bear the cost of the economic disruption. The importance of cultural assimilation features prominently in Kirk's immigration analysis. He argues that successful societies require shared values and common identity that transcend ethnic or racial differences. Immigration can strengthen America when newcomers adopt American values and contribute to American culture, but mass immigration without assimilation creates fragmented societies that cannot sustain democratic governance. Kirk emphasises that expecting assimilation is not xenophobic, but rather represents the normal expectation that all successful societies have maintained throughout history. Kirk's analysis of educational reform reveals his belief that restoring American excellence requires fundamental changes to how young people learn about their country and its principles. He argues that education should teach students to think critically about American history while maintaining appropriate appreciation for American achievements and values. This means rejecting both uncritical nationalism and systematic anti-Americanism in favour of balanced historical understanding that prepares students for engaged citizenship. The restoration of democratic accountability emerges as a crucial theme in Kirk's political analysis. He argues that the growth of unelected bureaucratic power has undermined the fundamental principle that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. The MAGA Doctrine seeks to restore power to elected officials who can be held accountable by voters, while reducing the influence of unelected experts who often pursue agendas that conflict with public preferences. Kirk's foreign policy philosophy emphasises the difference between strength and aggression in international relations. He argues that America should maintain overwhelming military superiority to deter potential adversaries while avoiding unnecessary military interventions that drain resources without serving clear national interests. This approach requires careful analysis of which international commitments truly serve American security versus those that represent imperial overstretch. The role of traditional institutions in maintaining social stability receives significant attention in Kirk's cultural analysis. He argues that families, religious communities, and other voluntary associations provide the moral foundation that makes democratic self-governance possible. Societies that systematically undermine these institutions inevitably experience social breakdown that makes authoritarian governance more likely. Kirk's emphasis on generational change reflects his understanding that political movements succeed by winning the support of younger Americans who will shape the country's future. He argues that the MAGA Doctrine must appeal to young people's desire for meaningful work, stable families, and genuine community rather than the shallow materialism and identity politics offered by progressive alternatives. The integration of these various elements into a coherent worldview represents Kirk's ultimate contribution to conservative political thought. Rather than treating economic, cultural, and foreign policy issues as separate concerns, the MAGA Doctrine attempts to show how they reinforce each other in creating either national strength or national decline. Charlie Kirk's The MAGA Doctrine represents a significant attempt to systematize and intellectualize what began as a primarily populist political movement, Whether readers agree or disagree with Kirk's conclusions, his work provides valuable insight into the ideas that have motivated millions of Americans to support fundamental changes in how their country approaches both domestic and international challenges. The book's strength lies in its comprehensive nature and Kirk's genuine attempt to address the concerns of ordinary Americans who feel that existing institutions have failed them. His focus on the next generation of conservative leaders reflects a sophisticated understanding that lasting political change requires more than electoral victories. It demands the cultivation of young people who can articulate and implement these ideas over decades. Critics will undoubtedly challenge many of Kirk's assumptions and conclusions, particularly his characterization of globalization's effects and his analysis of American cultural changes. However, the book succeeds in presenting a coherent, alternative vision that addresses real concerns about America's direction, even if readers disagree with proposed solutions. Perhaps most significantly, Kirk's work demonstrates how political movements evolve from reactive protests into proactive governing philosophies. The MAGA Doctrine, as Kirk presents it, has moved beyond simple opposition to the status quo toward a comprehensive vision of American renewal based on specific principles and policies. For anyone seeking to understand contemporary American conservative thought, particularly among younger demographics, Kirk's systematic presentation of these ideas provides essential insight into the intellectual framework that continues to shape American political discourse and policy debates across the nation.